The city is already old when Rashop is born. That matters. Ugarit has been a settlement for almost 6,000 years by the time he draws his first breath. Layers of habitation going back to the Neolithic, stacked under his feet like pages in a book he will spend his life learning to read. The tell, the artificial mound created by millennia of people building on the rubble of previous people, rises about 20 meters above the surrounding plain, at the point on the Syrian coast where the Nahr el-Fid River meets the Mediterranean, roughly 10 kilometers north of what is now Latakia. The harbor sits at a small bay called Minit el-Beida, White Harbor, and it faces west towards Cyprus, which on a clear day you can see as a dark smudge on the horizon. Rashop grows up seeing that smudge. He grows up hearing languages. That is the first thing to understand about Ugarit. It is not a city of one people.
It is a city of transactions, and transactions require translation, and translation requires scribes. By the 14th century BCE, the period of Ugarit's greatest prosperity, the period into which Rashop is born, the city's royal palace alone covers nearly a hectare. It contains 90 rooms. Several of those rooms are archives. The archives hold tablets in Sumerian, Akkadian, Hurrian, Hittite, Egyptian Hieratic, Cypro-Minoan, and, this is the one that changed the world, Ugaritic, written in the city's own invention, a cuneiform alphabet of 30 letters. Now, here's where I need to stop and explain what that means, because the word alphabet gets thrown around casually, and the thing Ugarit created was not casual at all. Before Ugarit, every writing system in the Near East worked on one of two principles. Either you drew a picture of the thing you meant, a pictogram that evolved into a logogram, which is how Sumerian cuneiform in Egyptian hieroglyphics started, or you used a sign to represent a syllable, a consonant-vowel combination, which is how Akkadian cuneiform functioned with its roughly 600 signs. Both systems worked. Both systems were powerful. Both systems required years of specialized training because you had to memorize hundreds or even thousands of signs to become literate. Writing, in the Bronze Age world, was a professional skill possessed by a tiny elite. In most cities, maybe 1 or 2% of the population could read. Scholars, like Wilfrid van Solt, working through the Ugarit tablet corpus at Leiden University, have documented that the scribal schools at Ugarit trained students in the traditional Mesopotamian curriculum, sign lists, lexical texts, mathematical tables, a process that took the better part of a decade. That is the world Rashop enters as a boy. He is selected, likely from a family with existing scribal connections because literacy in this period tends to be hereditary, and placed into the tablet house. But Ugarit has done something radical. Sometime around 1400 BCE, someone in this city, we do not know who, looked at the hundreds of cuneiform signs used to write Akkadian and asked a question that sounds simple but was, in practice, revolutionary. What if each sign represented not a syllable, but a single consonant sound? What if you could write any word in any language with only 30 signs? The answer was the Ugaritic alphabet. 30 cuneiform characters, each one a consonant. They were written left to right on clay tablets using the same wedge-shaped reed stylus that Mesopotamian scribes had used for 2,000 years, but the system itself was entirely new.
It was the first alphabet, or more precisely, the first abjad, a writing system based on consonants that used cuneiform technology to do something cuneiform had never been designed to do. Rashop learns this system as a child. He also learns the old systems because Ugarit's scribes need both. The city's internal records, literary texts, ritual instructions, administrative lists are written in Ugaritic. But its diplomatic correspondence is in Akkadian, the lingua franca of late Bronze Age international relations, and its religious texts sometimes use Hurrian, and certain trade documents arrive in scripts from Cyprus and Egypt. A senior scribe in the royal palace has to move between these worlds. Rashop moves between them. He is not, so far as we can reconstruct, a person of great ambition. He does not appear in any of the preserved tablets as a named individual. I have given him a name drawn from the Ugaritic pantheon, where Rashop is a god of plague and war, because the irony will become apparent. But the scribes of Ugarit were real people who left physical traces. We know their handwriting. Tablet analysts have identified individual hands across the archive, the same way a graphologist identifies handwriting today. Some scribes wrote with a heavier pressure, some had a distinctive way of forming the horizontal wedge, some made consistent spelling choices that amount to personal style. Rashop, as I imagine him, is one of those hands. He is competent, consistent, and fast. He takes dictation from the king, he copies literary texts for the temple library, he catalogs incoming correspondence. And the correspondence is extraordinary. Ugarit, in the 14th and 13th centuries BCE, sits at the intersection of every major power in the known world.
To the south lies Egypt under the 19th dynasty, Ramesses II, then Merneptah. To the north and east lies the Hittite Empire, whose vassal Ugarit technically is. To the west, across the water, lies Alashia, Cyprus, rich in copper. To the southeast lie the Assyrians, growing stronger. To the south along the coast lie the other Levantine ports, Byblos, Sidon, Tyre. The grain ships come from Egypt, the copper comes from Cyprus. The tin, essential for making bronze, which is the defining technology of the age, comes from somewhere far to the east, possibly Afghanistan, possibly Central Asia, through a chain of intermediaries that passes through Mesopotamia and into Ugarit's warehouses. Rashop handles the paperwork for this system. That sounds mundane. It is not. Every treaty, every trade agreement, every royal marriage negotiation, every complaint about a shipment of copper ingots that arrived underweight, all of it passes through clay, through stylus, through the hands of men like him. The archive is the nervous system of the city. Without it, the king cannot negotiate, the merchants cannot settle disputes, the priests cannot perform the correct rituals on the correct days. Rashop understands this. He understands that the tablet is not a record of power.
It is power. Let me tell you about the city he lives in, because Ugarit in the 13th century BCE is a place worth seeing. The royal palace dominates the western part of the tell, overlooking the harbor. It is a massive mud brick and stone structure with an internal courtyard, a sunken garden, administrative wings, and the archive rooms where Rashop works. The walls are thick, some of them 2 meters, and plastered smooth. The floors are paved, there are drainage channels, there is indoor plumbing of a kind, terracotta pipes that carry wastewater from upper rooms down through the walls and into stone-lined drains beneath the streets. The French archaeologist Claude Schaeffer, who excavated Ras Shamra beginning in 1929 and continuing for decades, described the palace as one of the most impressive Bronze Age structures in the Levant. Its archive rooms contained hundreds of tablets in multiple languages, organized, as near as we can tell, by subject and by the language of the correspondent.
South of the palace, the residential quarters climb the slope of the tell. The houses are stone-founded, mud brick walled, 2 stories in many cases, with interior courtyards and private tombs beneath the floors. This is important. The dead in Ugarit are buried under the houses of the living. Family tombs, stone-built corbelled vaults accessed through a hole in the floor, contain multiple generations. The living pour libations to the dead through clay pipes that penetrate the floor and reach the tomb below. The dead in Ugaritic religion are not gone. They are the Rephaim, the shades, the healed ones, and they still need to eat, still need to drink, still need to be spoken to.
Rashop, every evening after his work in the archive, pours a measure of wine into the pipe in the floor of his family's house and speaks to his father and his grandfather and his great-grandfather who lie in the darkness below his feet. 2 major temples stand on the Acropolis, the Temple of Baal and the Temple of Dagon. Baal, the storm god, the rider of clouds, the one who defeated the sea god Yam and the death god Mot, is the patron deity of the city. The literary texts that Rashab copies and maintains in the archive include the Baal cycle, one of the great mythological narratives of the ancient Near East, the story of Baal's battle against Yam for kingship among the gods, his construction of a palace on Mount Zaphon, and his descent into the underworld where Mot swallows him and the earth goes barren until Baal's sister Anat tears Mot apart and Baal rises again.
It is a story of death and resurrection, of cosmic struggle and seasonal return, and it is written in poetry of startling beauty and violence. Rashab copies this text. He knows every line. He knows the passage where Anat wades through blood up to her knees, where she fastens heads to her belt and hands to her waist, and plunges into battle with a joy that the text describes without apology. He knows the passage where Baal and Mot grapple like wild bulls, biting and kicking and goring, and the sun goddess, Shapash, intervenes to separate them. He knows the ending, or what we have of it, because the tablets are fragmentary, where Baal is restored to his throne, and the rains return, and the grain grows. He copies this text because it is sacred, but also because it is literature, and Ugarit values literature. The city has a literary tradition that includes not just the Baal cycle, but the legend of Ugarit, about a king who loses his family and is commanded by El, the father of the gods, to march to war and win a bride, and the legend of Akhat, about a young prince who was given a divine bow by the craftsman god Kothar Wahasis, refuses to give it to the goddess Anat, and is killed for his refusal. These texts are sophisticated. They use parallelism, repetition, dramatic irony, dialogue, and narrative structure in ways that scholars of ancient Near Eastern literature compare directly to early biblical poetry. Dennis Pardee of the University of Chicago, one of the foremost experts on the Ugaritic language, has spent decades demonstrating the linguistic and literary connections between Ugaritic texts and the Hebrew Bible. Shared vocabulary, shared poetic structures, shared mythological motifs, the storm god who defeats the sea, the divine council where gods deliberate, the descent to the underworld. The feast on the holy mountain. Ugarit did not invent these ideas, but Ugarit wrote them down in the first alphabet, and in doing so, created a textual tradition that would ripple forward through Phoenician, Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, Latin, and eventually into the script you are reading right now. Rashab does not know this. He does not know that the alphabet he uses every day will outlive not just his city, but every empire he has ever heard of. He knows that it is efficient. He knows that a young student can learn the 30 signs in weeks rather than years. He knows that merchants in the harbor quarter, men who are not professional scribes, can scratch out basic inventories and receipts using the alphabetic script, which is something that would be inconceivable in a purely logographic or syllabic system. The alphabet democratizes literacy. Not completely, not to everyone, but enough that Ugarit's commercial class can participate in the written world in a way that the commercial class of, say, Babylon cannot. This is the quiet revolution happening in the room where Rashab works. He does not think of it as a revolution. He thinks of it as his job. His job gets more complicated in the last decades of the 13th century BCE. The letters that arrive in the archive begin to change tone. For generations, the correspondence between Ugarit and its overlord, the Hittite emperor, and between Ugarit and its trading partners has been mostly commercial and diplomatic. Grain shipments, copper prices, marriage negotiations, border disputes, the routine friction of interconnected states. But now the letters carry a new word, or rather, a new anxiety. The word is ships. Ships on the coast, ships raiding coastal towns, ships carrying warriors who do not belong to any recognized state. The Hittite emperor writes to the king of Ugarit, demanding that Ugarit send its fleet and its infantry to reinforce Hittite positions in Anatolia and along the Cilician coast. The king of Ugarit writes back, and we have this letter, or a draft of it, explaining that his army and his fleet are already deployed elsewhere, that his defenses are stretched thin, that enemy ships have been sighted off his own coast. He asks for help. He is told that no help is available. This is the Late Bronze Age collapse. It is one of the most studied and least understood catastrophes in ancient history. Between roughly 1200 and 1550 BCE, virtually every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean either fell or contracted catastrophically. The Hittite Empire was destroyed. Mycenaean Greece collapsed. The Egyptian Empire withdrew from the Levant. Cities across Cyprus, the Levantine coast, and Anatolia were burned, abandoned, or reduced to villages.
The elaborate international trade network that had sustained these civilizations for centuries, the copper, the tin, the grain, the textiles, the diplomatic marriages, the cuneiform correspondence, stopped. Just stopped. The causes are debated. Eric Klein, in his influential book 1177 BC, The Year Civilization Collapsed, argues that it was not a single cause, but a cascading systems failure. Drought, famine, earthquake, internal rebellion, disruption of trade routes, and the migrations or raids of the so-called Sea Peoples, groups identified in Egyptian texts as Peliset, Cheker, Shekelesh, Denyen, Weshesh, and others, all hitting interconnected and therefore interdependent civilizations simultaneously. When one node in the network failed, it stressed the others. When enough nodes failed, the network itself collapsed. It was, Klein argues, the first example of a globalized system failing globally. Rashop lives at the failing node. The king of Ugarit in the final years, his name was probably Amurapi, the last king of the dynasty, is writing frantic letters. We have them.
They were found in the archive and in the kiln where they were being baked for sending. One of them, addressed to the king of Alashia, Cyprus, reads in part, "My father, the enemy ships are already here. They have set fire to my towns and have done very great damage in the country. My father, did you not know that all my troops and chariots are in the land of Hadi, and all my ships are in the land of Luca? Thus the country is abandoned to itself. Consider this, my father. There are 7 enemy ships that have come and done very great damage. Now if there are more enemy ships, let me know about them so that I may know what to do." This letter was found in the kiln. It was never sent. The response from the king of Alashia, found separately on the Cypriot end, essentially says, "I understand. I am also under attack. I cannot help you. Protect yourself."
Rashop, as I imagine him, is the one who takes the dictation for that unsent letter. He is the one who prepares the clay, who wets it to the correct consistency, who holds the reed stylus and inscribes the king's words in the formal Akkadian used for international correspondence. He has done this 1,000 times. He has written letters about grain prices and copper shipments and the proper protocol for receiving an Egyptian envoy. This is different. This letter contains the word abandoned. The country is abandoned to itself. He fires the tablet. He puts it in the kiln. He does not know that it will be the last tablet to enter that kiln, that the kiln will not be opened again for 3,180-odd years, that the litter will be pulled from the debris of a burned building by French archaeologists in the 20th century and translated and published and become one of the most famous documents of the ancient world. He does not know any of this. He knows that the king is afraid. He knows that the fleet is gone. He knows that smoke has been seen from the direction of coastal towns to the south. Let me reconstruct his final days. Not with certainty, we cannot have certainty, but with the evidence that the ground and the tablets and the burned layers provide. The destruction of Ugarit was violent and total. The archaeological evidence, documented by Schaefer and subsequent excavators, including Marguerite Yonne, shows a comprehensive burn layer across the tell. Buildings collapsed. Mud brick walls were fired red by the heat. Objects were left in place, pottery on shelves, tablets in their archive rooms, bronze tools on workshop floors, indicating that the destruction was sudden and that the population did not have time to evacuate their valuables. Bronze arrowheads of types associated with Aegean or Cypriot military traditions were found embedded in walls and scattered in destruction debris. Sling bullets, evidence of violent assault. The city was not rebuilt. After the destruction, which is dated by associated pottery and scarabs to approximately 1185 BCE, give or take a decade, the site was abandoned. People eventually returned to the area. There is sparse Iron Age occupation, but the city of Ugarit, the palace, the temples, the archive, the harbor, all of it was gone. Done. Rashop does not survive this. I will not pretend otherwise. The evidence says the city was sacked and burned in a single event, and the population was killed, enslaved, or dispersed. A man who spent his life in the archive room of the royal palace. A man who was, by the nature of his position, physically inside the administrative center of the city, did not walk out. But what he left behind did walk out. Not physically, conceptually. The alphabet Ugarit invented, the principle that a writing system could represent individual consonant sounds with a small set of learnable signs, did not die with the city. The idea had already spread. Down the coast, the Phoenicians, Ugarit's neighbors and in some sense cultural cousins, were developing their own alphabetic script. The Phoenician alphabet was not cuneiform. It used linear signs, drawn with ink on papyrus, or scratched into stone and metal, rather than wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay. But the principle was the same: one sign, one sound. And the Phoenician alphabet had 22 letters, even more economical than Ugarit's 30. The relationship between the Ugaritic and Phoenician alphabets is debated. Some scholars argue direct descent. Others argue parallel development from a common ancestor, the Proto-Sinaitic script found in turquoise mines in the Sinai Peninsula, dating to roughly the 18th or 19th century BCE. The exact genealogy is uncertain. What is not uncertain is that the idea, the alphabetic idea, the insight that you can decompose language into its smallest functional sound units and represent each one with a single sign, was in the air on the Levantine coast in the late 2nd millennium BCE, and Ugarit was one of the places, perhaps the first place, where that idea was formalized into a complete working system. The Phoenician alphabet traveled. The Greeks adopted it around the 9th or 8th century BCE, adding vowel signs that the Phoenician system lacked. The Greek alphabet generated the Etruscan alphabet, which generated the Latin alphabet. The Phoenician alphabet also generated the Aramaic script, which generated Hebrew and Arabic. Every alphabet in use on Earth today, Latin, Greek, Cyrillic, Arabic, Hebrew, Devanagari derivatives, traces back to this Levantine coastal innovation. Rashop's 30 cuneiform signs are the seed. He did not know this. He could not know it. He sat in a room and wrote on clay, and the room burned and the clay survived because fires would bake clay, and the destruction that ended his life preserved his work, and the work outlived the city and the empire and the entire Bronze Age world that had produced it. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to the years before the end, because the end is only the last chapter, and Ugarit's story is not only about how it died, it is about how it lived. Rashop is trained in the tablet house. The curriculum, as reconstructed from student exercises found at the site, follows the standard Mesopotamian model. The student begins with sign lists, endless, repetitive lists of cuneiform signs and their values. Then lexical lists, Sumerian words with their Akkadian equivalents, organized thematically. Animals, plants, wooden objects, stone objects, professions, gods.
The student copies these lists over and over until muscle memory takes hold, until the hand forms the signs without conscious effort. Then mathematical texts, tables of reciprocals, multiplication tables, problems about canals and fields and volumes of grain. Then literary texts, excerpts from Sumerian and Akkadian classics. And then, at Ugarit, something that does not happen in Mesopotamian schools, training in the local alphabetic script and in the literary and ritual texts composed in the Ugaritic language. This is a bilingual education in the deepest sense.
Rashop learns to think in Akkadian for diplomacy, in Ugaritic for local administration and literature, in Sumerian for scholarly prestige. Even though Sumerian has been a dead language for centuries by this point, it retains its status as the language of learning, the way Latin functioned in medieval Europe. He also acquires at least reading competence in Hurrian, because Ugarit has a substantial Hurrian-speaking population, and Hurrian religious texts are part of the temple archive. He may learn basic Egyptian hieratic for reading trade documents that arrive from the south. He may learn the Cypro-Minoan signs used on tablets from Alashia, though this script remains undeciphered today and may have been only partially understood even at the time. 7 scripts. Multiple languages, one man, one reed stylus, one small room lit by an oil lamp made of baked clay. The tablet house is attached to the Temple of Baal, or possibly to the royal palace. The architectural relationship is debated because the relevant section of the tell was disturbed by later occupation and by early excavation techniques that were less careful about stratigraphy than modern standards demand. But the tablets are clear. Student exercise tablets, small, irregular, covered in clumsy signs that gradually improve, sit alongside master copies in the same archive rooms. Teaching and production happened in the same space. Rashop would have been trained by a senior scribe, possibly a member of his own family. He would have begun as a child, 8, 9 years old, and would not have been considered fully competent until his late teens or early 20s. By the time he is working independently, the city around him is at its peak. The harbor at Minit El Beida handles ships from Egypt, Cyprus, the Aegean, and the Anatolian coast. Warehouses along the waterfront store copper ingots, the ox-hide-shaped ingots, roughly 60 centimeters long and weighing about 29 kilograms each, that are the standard unit of copper trade across the late Bronze Age Mediterranean. Tin arrives in smaller quantities but at higher value. The two metals are combined to make bronze, and bronze is the material from which the age takes its name. Weapons, tools, vessels, fittings, sculptures. Without tin, there is no bronze. Without bronze, there are no weapons. Without weapons, well... Ugarit also exports textiles. The city is famous for its purple-dyed wool, produced from the murex sea snail, the same animal that will later make Phoenician Tyre wealthy. Industrial installations for murex processing have been identified at Minit El Beida, stone vats, shell middens, the chemical signature of the dye. The textile trade is enormously lucrative. A single piece of purple-dyed cloth can be worth its weight in silver. Rashop records textile shipments in the palace archive. He records the names of merchants, the quantities, the destinations. He also records legal disputes. Ugarit has a developed legal system. Contracts are written on clay, sealed with cylinder seals, small stone cylinders carved with scenes or inscriptions that are rolled across wet clay to leave an impression, functioning like a notarized signature. Property transfers, marriage contracts, inheritance disputes, commercial agreements, manumission of slaves, adoption, all of it is documented. The legal texts give us an unusually detailed picture of daily life. We know the price of a house. We know what a divorce settlement looked like. We know that women could own property and initiate legal proceedings, which was not universal in the ancient Near East. We know that the king served as the court of final appeal and that his decisions were recorded and archived. Rashop writes these decisions. He is present in the room when the king adjudicates between a merchant who claims he was cheated on a shipment of copper and a ship captain who claims the merchant ever paid. He inscribes the king's ruling.
He rolls the king's cylinder seal across the wet surface of the tablet. He files the tablet in the archive, in the correct room, on the correct shelf, in the correct order. This is the work. This is the daily, unremarkable, essential work of maintaining a literate civilization. And then the letters start to change. It does not happen all at once. The first signs of trouble are oblique, embedded in the routine diplomatic correspondence. A request from the Hittite emperor for additional troops. A report of unrest among vassal states in western Anatolia. A mention of grain shortages in the Hittite homeland. Individually, none of these are alarming. The Hittite Empire has always demanded troops from its vassals. Grain shortages happen. Unrest happens. But Rashomap reads all the letters, and he begins to notice a pattern. The requests are becoming more frequent. The tone is becoming sharper. The Hittite Emperor is not asking, he is commanding, and he is commanding more than Ugarit can give.
The king of Ugarit, Amurapi, responds with careful diplomatic language that Rashap crafts. The language says yes, while meaning not yet. It promises compliance while requesting delays. It is the language of a vassal who understands that his overlord is weakening and that the balance of obligations is shifting, but who cannot say this openly because the overlord still has the power to punish disobedience. Meanwhile, let me describe what Rashap sees when he walks from the palace to his home in the residential quarter. The streets are narrow and unpaved, flanked by the stone foundations of two-story houses. Drainage channels run down the center, carrying wastewater toward the edge of the tell. Donkeys carry goods from the harbor up the slope. Merchants argue in at least 3 languages in the market area near the southern gate. A woman on a rooftop is drying figs on a reed mat. Children play in a courtyard. A metalworker's furnace glows orange in a ground-floor workshop. The smell is complex. Salt air, charcoal smoke, animal dung, the sharp chemical stink of murex processing drifting up from the harbor, bread baking, olive oil heating in a pan. This is a living city. It has been living for thousands of years. The tombs beneath the houses hold generation after generation of its dead, and the living walk over them every day, and the connection between the two worlds is maintained through ritual and libation, and the constant physical reminder that the floor you stand on is the ceiling of the room where your ancestors sleep. Rashap pours the wine. He speaks to his father. He asks perhaps whether his father has any wisdom about what is coming. His father does not answer. The dead in Ugaritic religion are not prophets. They are presences. They receive offerings. They are honored. But they do not predict the future. The future arrives anyway. A letter comes from the king of Alashia. It warns of enemy ships. 20 ships, it says, were spotted in coastal waters. Where they came from, the letter does not say. Who commands them, the letter does not say. What they want, the letter does not need to say. Ships, in this context, means raiders. Raiders means burning. Amurapi drafts his response. Rashap writes it. The response says, "My troops are in Hatti. My ships are in Luka. I am alone." Another letter arrives, this one from a Hittite official, possibly the viceroy of Carchemish, a major Hittite administrative center on the Euphrates. The letter instructs Amurapi to send grain. The Hittite homeland is starving. This is a direct order from the imperial administration. Amurapi must comply. But compliance means sending grain that his own population needs at a time when his military is already deployed elsewhere. Rashap writes the response to this letter, too. The tone is strained. You can feel it in the tablets. The formal courtesies are maintained, the elaborate greeting formulas, the blessings, the protestations of loyalty,
But beneath the formula, the message is, I cannot give what I do not have. This is the paradox of the late Bronze Age system. Its strength was interconnection. Egypt's grain fed Hittite armies. Cypriot copper armed Egyptian soldiers. Ugaritic textiles clothed everyone. Tin from Afghanistan passed through a dozen intermediaries to reach the bronze foundries of every major city. When the system worked, everyone prospered. When it faltered, everyone suffered because no one was self-sufficient. The system was efficient, but not resilient. It had no redundancy. It had no fallback. I want to pause here and bring in something specific from the archaeological record, because the destruction of Ugarit has left physical evidence that goes beyond the tablets. Excavations by Marguerite Yon and the French Archaeological Mission from the 1970s through the 2000s documented the destruction layer in detail across multiple areas of the site. The burn layer is consistent, roughly half a meter thick in places, containing collapsed mud brick that has been fired red, carbonized wooden beams, smashed pottery, and, critically, arrowheads. The arrowheads found in the destruction layer include types that are not local to the Levantine coast. Some are tanged bronze points associated with Aegean or Anatolian military traditions. Others are leaf-shaped, consistent with types found at other destruction-level sites across the eastern Mediterranean. This tells us two things. The destruction was military, not just seismic or accidental, and the attackers carried weapons from multiple cultural traditions, which is consistent with the mixed ethnic identification of the so-called Sea Peoples described in Egyptian texts, particularly the Medinet Habu inscriptions of Ramesses III, which date to approximately 1178 BCE and describe a coalition of maritime raiders from the islands in the midst of the sea. Rashab hears the news before he sees the smoke. A runner from the harbor. Ships. Enemy ships. How many? The runner does not know. More than 7. The last letter, the one in the kiln, has already been written. It is being fired. The kiln takes time. Hours. You build the fire, you let the heat build, you wait. Rashab has fired thousands of tablets. He knows the process. He knows the sound the clay makes when it contracts in the heat. A faint ticking, almost inaudible, like the city's heartbeat slowing. The fire in the kiln is still burning when a different fire starts. The harbor district, the warehouses, the wooden ships at anchor, then the residential quarter, then the palace. I do not know exactly what Rashab does. Nobody does. The tablets do not record the destruction from the inside. The last tablet is the letter in the kiln, and the letter is addressed outward to Cyprus, asking for help that will not come. What I know is what the ground says. The ground says fire. The ground says collapse. The ground says arrowheads embedded in mud brick walls at the height a person would stand. The ground says that the palace's 90 rooms burned, and the roof beams fell, and the archive tablets were buried under tons of rubble and burned mud brick and stayed there in darkness for 31 centuries. The tablets survived because of the fire. That is the central paradox of cuneiform archaeology. Unfired clay tablets are fragile. They crumble when wet, they break when handled roughly, they dissolve over centuries. But when a building burns around them, the fire does what the kiln does. It bakes the clay, hardens it, turns a temporary record into a permanent one. Ugarit's archives survived because Ugarit was destroyed. If the city had been peacefully abandoned, the tablets would have dissolved in the rain and the damp and the centuries of erosion, and we would have nothing. We would not know about the alphabet. We would not have the Baal cycle. We would not have the letters. We would not know Ugarit's name. Destruction preserved. That is not a metaphor. That is chemistry. Rashib's work, the tablets he inscribed, the texts he copied, the letters he drafted, the legal records he filed, survived inside the ruin of the room where he made them. His body did not survive. His name did not survive. His family's tomb beneath his house was buried under the destruction debris and the slow accumulation of centuries of soil and vegetation and the patient geological work of rain and root and the gradual transformation of a burned city into a tell, a mound, a hill with grass on it, and nothing visible to indicate that anything had ever stood there. Until 1928. In 1928, a local farmer plowing a field near the coast struck a stone slab with his plow blade. The slab covered a tomb. The tomb contained Mycenaean and Cypriot pottery. The French colonial authorities were informed. Claude Schaeffer, a young archaeologist from Strasbourg, was dispatched to investigate. He arrived in 1929 and began excavating what he initially thought was a minor coastal necropolis. It was not minor. It was the harbor district of Ugarit, and the tell behind it, Ras Shamra, the name the locals used, meaning fennel mound because wild fennel grew on the slope, was the city itself. Schaeffer excavated at Ras Shamra for nearly 40 years, interrupted by World War II. His work was monumental in scope and occasionally brutal in method. Early 20th century excavation techniques did not always prioritize the meticulous stratigraphic recording that modern archaeology demands, and some contextual information was lost. But the discoveries were staggering. The palace, the temples, the residential quarter, and the tablets. Thousands of tablets in multiple languages, including an entirely unknown script. The decipherment of the Ugaritic alphabet was achieved with remarkable speed. The French scholars Charles Viterlot and Edouard Dorme, along with the German Hans Bauer, worked independently and collaboratively in the early 1930s. The fact that the script had only 30 signs was itself a clue. It was clearly alphabetic, not logographic or syllabic. The language turned out to be a Semitic language closely related to Phoenician and Hebrew, which meant that once the sound values of the signs were established, the texts could be read with reference to known Semitic vocabulary and grammar. The Baal cycle was among the first major literary texts to be translated. Its impact on biblical scholarship was immediate and lasting. Scholars recognized parallels between Baal's victory over the sea god Yam and Yahweh's defeat of the sea in biblical poetry, between El's divine counsel and the divine counsel described in Psalms and Job, between the language used to describe Baal's theophany, his appearance in storm and lightning and thunder, and the language used to describe Yahweh's theophany in similar passages. The Ugaritic texts did not prove that the Bible borrowed from Canaanite mythology. They proved that the Bible emerged from the same cultural and literary world that Ugarit inhabited, that the poets who composed the Psalms and the prophetic literature were drawing on a shared Levantine tradition of religious imagery and poetic technique that was already ancient by the time it was written down in Hebrew. Reshap's library, the texts he copied and maintained and shelved in the archive rooms of the palace, turned out to be the key to understanding the literary prehistory of one of the most influential textual traditions in human history. He did not know this. He copied the Baal cycle because it was sacred and beautiful, and because it was his job. He maintained the archive because the archive was the city's memory, and the city's memory was his responsibility. He wrote the king's last letter because the king told him to write it. He put the letter in the kiln because letters must be fired before they can be sent. And then the city burned, and the kiln burned, and the letter was fired anyway, by a fire that was not his, for a reason that had nothing to do with sending. The letter sits today in a museum. The cuneiform is as clear as the day it was inscribed. The king's words in Reshap's hand, or in the hand of whoever held the stylus that day, a hand we can identify by its pressure and its letter forms but cannot name, ask for help against ships on the horizon. The ships came. The help did not. After the destruction, the Levantine coast reorganized. The Phoenician cities to the south, Byblos, Sidon, Tyre, survived the collapse, diminished but intact. Over the following centuries, they rebuilt and expanded.
They took the alphabetic principle that Ugarit had pioneered and they refined it, streamlined it, carried it aboard their merchant ships to every corner of the Mediterranean. The Phoenician alphabet reached Greece by the 8th century BCE. It reached Italy. It reached North Africa. It reached Spain.
Every letter you have read in this sentence descended through a chain of adaptations and borrowing spanning 3,000 years from the innovation that happened in a small room in a coastal city in Syria where a scribe pressed a reed stylus into wet clay and represented the sounds of human speech with 30 marks. The room burned. The marks survived. The scribe did not. That is the story of Ugarit. Not a story of conquest or glory or imperial ambition, a story of work, of daily, careful, painstaking, unglamorous work, copying texts, filing tablets, drafting letters, maintaining the archive that held the city's knowledge and the city's memory and the city's connections to the wider world. The work was done by people whose names we do not know, in rooms that were destroyed, for a civilization that ended in a single afternoon of fire and bronze-tipped arrows, and the work outlived everything. It outlived the palace and the temples and the harbor and the king and the empire and the entire Bronze Age world. It outlived the fire that was supposed to destroy it but instead preserved it. It outlived the 31 centuries of dirt and rain and silence that buried it. It outlived the farmer's plow that struck the stone slab in 1928, and the archaeologist who pulled the first tablet from the rubble, and the scholars who deciphered the script and published the texts, and argued about their meaning in academic journals and conferences and footnotes. The work is still here. The tablets are still legible. The alphabet is still in use. Rashop pressed a reed into clay. You are reading the consequence. That is not nothing. That is everything.